Nearly 15 years after their disappearance, a decision has been made in the case of the Skelton brothers, Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. Probate judge Catherine Sala has just issued her ruling that the petition to declare the missing brothers legally dead has been granted. The brothers were last seen on Thanksgiving in 2010 and were with their father, John Skelton. Let's take a listen together to the particulars of the judge's ruling.
The atmosphere in Morenci, Michigan, on November 26, 2010, was defined by the biting, damp chill of a Midwestern late autumn. For the 2,100 residents of this quiet border town, located just a stone's throw from the Ohio state line, Black Friday was traditionally a day of recovery, a time for finishing leftovers, navigating early holiday sales, and enjoying the lingering warmth of family gatherings. But for Tanya Zuvers, this Friday was marked by a different kind of anticipation. It was the day her three young sons, Andrew, 9, Alexander, 7, and Tanner, 5, were supposed to return home. They had spent the Thanksgiving holiday with their father, John Skelton, as part of a court-sanctioned visitation agreement. In the fragile aftermath of a crumbling marriage, Tanya lived for these handovers, counting the minutes until the three boys, known for their infectious energy and bright smiles, would be back under her roof. The backdrop to this holiday was not one of peace, but of a deteriorating domestic situation that had reached a breaking point. John and Tanya's marriage had been fracturing for months, culminating in a bitter separation in September 2010. John, a long-distance truck driver, was a man whose behavior had become increasingly erratic and volatile. To those outside the family, he might have seemed like a typical father, but behind closed doors, the tension was suffocating. Just weeks before Thanksgiving, John had taken the boys to Florida without Tanya's knowledge or consent, a move she and her legal team viewed as a blatant kidnapping attempt. He had eventually returned, but the incident left a permanent stain of distrust. Despite the glaring red flags and Tanya's growing apprehension, the legal system and the hope of maintaining a semblance of co-parenting normalcy allowed John his scheduled time for the holiday. He was granted the boys for Thanksgiving, with the ironclad agreement that they would be returned to Tanya's care by Friday afternoon. On the morning of Friday, November 26th, the silence surrounding John Skelton's small home on State Street was heavy and absolute. Only a day earlier, neighbors had observed the three brothers playing in the yard, their laughter echoing through the crisp November air. Andrew, the eldest, was often seen looking out for his younger brothers, Alexander and Tanner, a protective trio that seemed inseparable. But by Friday morning, the activity had ceased. At approximately 11:30 a.m., Tanya arrived at the designated meeting spot to reclaim her children. The house was still. John's vehicle was missing. Her repeated phone calls went directly to voicemail, and her text messages, initially polite, then increasingly frantic, disappeared into a digital void. The familiar knot of anxiety in Tanya's stomach, which had been a constant companion since the separation, suddenly transformed into a cold, paralyzing dread that something was fundamentally wrong. The investigation did not begin with a missing persons report, but with a medical emergency. While Tanya was searching for her sons, John Skelton had been admitted to a hospital in Ohio, just across the state line. He had attempted to hang himself in his home earlier that morning, but had survived. When investigators finally reached his bedside, they weren't interested in his health so much as the three empty chairs at the Thanksgiving table. Their question was singular and urgent. Where are the boys? John's initial response was not the panic of a grieving father, but a calculated, manipulative fog. He looked the investigators in the eye and spun a tale that would haunt the case for the next 15 years. He claimed he had handed Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner over to a woman named Joanne Taylor, whom he described as a high-ranking member of an underground sanctuary group. He insisted that he had sent the boys away to protect them from Tanya, whom he baselessly accused of being an unfit and abusive mother. He claimed they were safe, hidden in a place where they could never be found. As John spoke, police were already swarming the State Street residence. The scene they found inside was chilling in its mundanity. The house was cold, the heat seemingly turned off. Inside, the investigators found the boys' winter coats and their shoes items. No parent in Michigan would forget if they were sending their children away on a long journey in late November. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no evidence of a hurried departure. It was as if the three brothers had simply evaporated into the gray Michigan mist. The Joanne Taylor story began to disintegrate under the slightest professional scrutiny. No such person existed in any state or federal database. No underground sanctuary group had any record of taking in 3 children from Verity. The realization hit the local authorities with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just dealing with a custody dispute or a disgruntled parent. They were standing at the beginning of a high-stakes hunt for 3 young lives, orchestrated by a father who was using his knowledge of their location as his ultimate weapon of control. While the town of Verity began to mobilize, hanging blue ribbons on every porch and organizing massive search parties to comb through frozen cornfields, murky ponds, and wooded lots, John Skelton remained in his hospital bed, weaving a web of contradictions. He changed his story repeatedly, moving from "they are with friends" to "I gave them to a pastor" to "I don't remember." Each lie was a calculated delay, a way to ensure that the trail grew colder with every passing hour. The Thanksgiving fracture had not just split a family. It had opened a void in the heart of the community. As the sun set on that first Friday, the investigators began to look toward the dark woods and the silent roads of Ohio, fearing that the secret John Skelton was keeping was much darker than a sanctuary. The silence in John Skelton's home was not just a lack of sound. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a father who had decided that if he could not have his children, no one would. As the first 48 hours passed, the small town of Verity transformed from a quiet border community into a frantic epicenter of hope and heartbreak. Neighbors who had seen Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner playing in the crisp November leaves just a day prior now stood on their porches, clutching their own children a little tighter, staring at the yellow police tape that fluttered like a warning flag in the biting Michigan wind. The investigators assigned to the case were seasoned men, yet even they felt the visceral shift in the air when they sat across from John in his hospital bed. There is a specific kind of chill that settles in a room when a parent speaks about their missing children with the detached coldness of a stranger. John did not cry for his boys. He did not beg the officers to find them. Instead, he spun a web of stories so intricate and so contradictory that it felt like a deliberate maze designed to waste the most precious commodity in any search: time. He spoke of a secret organization, a group of protectors he called the Underground Sanctuary. He whispered the name Joanne Taylor, a woman he claimed was a savior who had taken the boys to a place where they would be safe from the supposed shadows of their mother's life. But as the FBI and state troopers tore through databases, there was no Joanne Taylor. There was no sanctuary. There was only a father who was playing a god complex in a hospital gown. The investigators began to realize that John was not trying to help them. He was performing. He was enjoying the power of being the only person on earth who knew where 3 innocent souls were resting. Outside those hospital walls, the human toll was devastating. Tanya Zuvers was living every mother's ultimate nightmare, a waking hell where every ringing phone was a heartbeat of hope followed by a crushing silence. The culture of Verity is one of grit and neighborly love, and that spirit exploded into action. Thousands of volunteers from across the state descended on the town. They waded through freezing swamps, their boots sinking into the thick Michigan mud. They used long poles to poke through the ice of ponds, their breaths hitching every time the wood struck something solid beneath the surface. They searched trash incinerators and heavy brush, driven by the desperate image of three small boys, cold and alone in the dark. But while the community searched with their hands, the digital investigators searched with their minds. They pulled the records for John's cell phone, and what they found was a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight into the heart of a lie. On the morning the boys vanished, John's phone had pinned off towers in remote, wooded areas of Ohio, near the village of Holiday City. It was a 25-mile trip that John had never mentioned. He had driven there in the pre-dawn darkness, into a landscape of deep woods and stagnant water, and he had returned alone. The timeline was suffocatingly tight. He had roughly 2 hours to do whatever he had done before returning home to attempt his own life. The psychological warfare John waged was relentless. He would give the police a crumb of information, a specific park or a certain trailhead, only to watch from afar as hundreds of officers exhausted themselves searching a location he knew was empty. It was a game of cat and mouse where the stakes were the lives of 3 children. The empathy of the public began to curdle into a fierce, righteous anger. How could a father look at the faces of his sons, Andrew's leadership, Alexander's quiet nature, Tanner's wide-eyed innocence, and choose to delete them from the world? By the end of that first week, the underground sanctuary theory had been exposed for what it was, a cruel fiction. The boxes of the boys' favorite toys sat untouched in Tanya's living room. Their winter boots remained by John's door, a haunting reminder that they had left without the very things they needed to survive the cold. The web of deceit was closing in on John Skelton, but the victory felt hollow, because as the evidence of his lies grew, the hope of finding 3 living boys began to fade into the gray, merciless Michigan winter. The investigation was no longer just a search. It was becoming a haunting journey into the mind of a man who believed that silence was his greatest strength. As the calendar pages turned from the frozen silence of 2010 into the uncertain spring of 2011, the town of Morenci remained suspended in a state of collective grief. The yellow ribbons on the oak trees had begun to fade, their edges frayed by the harsh Michigan winds, mirroring the exhaustion of a community that had spent months scouring every inch of the earth. For Tanya Zuvers, the passage of time was not a healer but a thief. Every morning she woke up to the same suffocating reality: 3 empty beds, 3 untouched sets of toys, and a silence in the hallways that felt louder than any scream. The legal system, designed to provide structure and justice, found itself paralyzed by the lack of physical evidence. There were no bodies, no murder weapon, and no confession. There was only the haunting absence of 3 little boys and the smug, impenetrable silence of the man who had last seen them alive. The prosecutors faced a harrowing dilemma that defines the most painful true crime cases. They knew in their hearts what had happened in that house on State Street, but proving it in a court of law was a different battle entirely. In 2011, the state of Michigan made a difficult strategic choice. Rather than risking a murder trial that might result in an acquittal due to the lack of remains,
John Skelton, the father of 3 boys who disappeared in 2010 and were never found, has now been charged with murder. Let's get live to Fox News' Hillary Golson. She's in Oak Park with the latest on this. Hillary.
Yeah, Roop, as you know, these 3 Skelton brothers have never been found despite searches that span Michigan and Ohio. And for a very long time, John Skelton, their father, was believed to be the prime suspect. In fact, the lead investigator of Michigan State Police said that he had no doubt earlier this year that it was Skelton who killed these 3 boys. As you mentioned, their bodies have never been found here. And suspicion started to grow, as you might imagine, when Skelton, back during the investigation, back to 2010, was telling investigators investigators conflicting stories about what happened to these boys, where they were. He even sent investigators to a schoolhouse in Ohio and a dumpster there, even turning over some evidence that apparently police said turned out not to be true. Now John Skelton is facing 3 counts of open murder and tampering with evidence.
They charged John Skelton with 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment. It was a legal compromise that felt like a betrayal to a grieving mother. How could the act of vanishing 3 children be reduced to a charge that sounded like a bureaucratic technicality? Yet, it was the only way to ensure that John did not walk out of that hospital and disappear into the shadows himself. The sentencing hearing was a visceral explosion of human emotion. Tanya stood in that wood-paneled courtroom, her voice trembling but her spirit unbreakable, as she looked at the man she had once loved and trusted with the lives of her children. She spoke of Andrew's protective nature, of how he led his brothers with a gentle hand. She spoke of Alexander's quiet curiosity and of Tanner's wide-eyed wonder at the world. She pleaded with John to simply tell her where they were, to give them a dignity that every human soul deserves, a place to rest. But John Skelton sat there like a stone. His eyes remained vacant, his face a mask of cold indifference. He was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison, the maximum allowed for the charge, but to the people of Morenci, it felt like a drop of water in an ocean of injustice. For the next decade, the case entered a period of agonizing limbo. John was moved to a prison cell, but he took the secret with him, tucked away like a prize he refused to share. Every few years, his name would appear on a parole board list, and every few years, Tanya and her family would have to relive the trauma all over again, writing letters and standing before officials to ensure he remained behind bars. The culture of the search changed from physical labor to digital persistence. Age progression photos were released, showing what Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner would look like as teenagers and young men. These images were a gut punch to the public, seeing the soft faces of children transformed by an artist's hand into the men they were never allowed to become. It reminded everyone that this wasn't just a cold case. It was a stolen future. Inside the prison walls, John Skelton remained a ghost of a man, occasionally granting interviews that only served to twist the knife deeper. He stuck to his sanctuary story, sometimes adding new cryptic details that would send investigators chasing ghosts in distant states. He seemed to relish the attention, using the lives of his sons as currency to stay relevant. Meanwhile, Tanya became a beacon of resilience. She refused to let the world forget their names. She organized vigils where the community would gather to light candles, the flickering flames reflected in the eyes of neighbors who still remembered the boys' laughter. This period of limbo was not just a legal state. It was a test of human endurance. It was a decade of asking the same question to a man who had traded his humanity for a lie, leaving a mother to navigate a world that kept moving forward while her heart remained frozen on a Black Friday morning in 2010. The years in Morenci did not just pass. They accumulated like heavy layers of winter snow, bearing the hope of a miracle but hardening the resolve for the truth. By the time 2025 arrived, Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton had been gone for nearly 15 years. In the eyes of the law, they were still classified as missing persons, a term that carries a cruel kind of ambiguity. It suggests a door left slightly ajar, an agonizing possibility that they might one day walk through it. But for Tanya Zuvers, the mother who had spent over 5,000 days counting the silence, the ambiguity had become an unbearable weight. She knew that to truly honor her sons, she had to stop chasing the ghost of a happy ending and start fighting for the finality of justice. This was no longer about a homecoming. It was about a reckoning. In March 2025, a courtroom that had seen years of procedural delays became the stage for a heart-wrenching legal milestone. A Michigan judge, after reviewing the staggering mountain of circumstantial evidence and the decade of John Skelton's failed stories,
It's been over a decade since the Skelton brothers of Morenci went missing. Now their mom wants them declared legally dead. Andre Norrells was in court today and joined us in studio with how people are reacting. Sad story, Andre.
Yeah, Dan, today was a pre-trial hearing where the judge approved the mother's request to declare Alexander, Andrew, and Tanner Skelton dead. Everyone we spoke to agreed with the family's decision and hopes this will somehow keep the boy's father in prison.
It's really up to the mother what she wants to do.
Officially declared the three Skelton brothers legally dead. The ruling was retroactive to 2015. It was a moment of profound, tragic irony that shook the community to its core. In most cases, a death certificate is a document of pure grief. But here, it was a weapon for the prosecution. This legal declaration finally stripped away the shield John had used for so long. It dismantled the absurd, cruel fantasy that his sons were still alive in some secret sanctuary. By declaring them dead, the state of Michigan was finally calling the tragedy by its true name. They were acknowledging that the laughter which vanished in 2010 would never echo through those hallways again. It was a formal goodbye to the boys they never got to see grow up. The timing of this legal shift was not accidental. It was a desperate race against a ticking clock. John Skelton was nearing the end of his 15-year sentence for unlawful imprisonment, the maximum the state could hold him for without a murder conviction. The thought of him walking out of those prison gates, breathing the fresh Michigan air, and returning to a world where his sons were no longer allowed to exist was a prospect that the community of Morenci simply could not stomach. The culture of a small town is built on memory, and the memory of the Skelton boys was still vibrant. It lived in the blue ribbons that stayed pinned to the oak trees, in the scholarships given in their names, and in the quiet, supportive nods Tanya received every time she walked down the street. The collective conscience of the entire state demanded that John Skelton not be allowed to trade his silence for his freedom. In November 2025, just weeks before John was scheduled to taste the liberty he had denied his children, the hammer finally fell. A grand jury, presented with a decade and a half of digital evidence, cell tower pings, and the sheer mathematical impossibility of John's evolving lies, indicted him on 3 counts of open murder.
7 News Detroit starts with breaking news.
First at noon, breaking news in one of Michigan's most notorious unsolved mysteries. Just weeks before his scheduled release from prison, John Skelton has been charged with 3 counts of open murder and 3 counts of tampering with evidence. Skelton has been serving 15 years for 3 unlawful imprisonment convictions in the disappearance of his 3 sons. According to court records, he was set to be released on November 29th. Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton disappeared while they were with their father in Morenci on Thanksgiving back in 2010. Earlier this year, a judge declared the 3 brothers legally dead. Despite countless searches over the years, they have never been found. It is not clear yet what evidence has led to these new murder charges against John Skelton, but 7 News Detroit is working to find out. Stay with us throughout the day as we learn more about this sudden shift in the case.
The courtroom was thick with a tension that felt like electricity. When the charges were read aloud, the room seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for 15 years. The indictment was a formal recognition of what every neighbor and every officer had feared from the very first night, that a father's hands, which should have been a source of ultimate protection, had instead become the instruments of an unthinkable betrayal. This 2025 reckoning was about more than just a trial date. It was a testament to the human spirit's refusal to let a crime be forgotten or a life be erased. It was about the investigators who had kept the boys' photos on their desks through 3 different administrations, and the neighbors who still looked into the dark woods every time they drove past the Ohio border. For Tanya, this was the beginning of a different kind of marathon. She stood on the courthouse steps, her face etched with the weariness of 1,000 battles, but her eyes burning with a new, fierce light. The legal system had finally caught up to the truth that her heart had known for a long time. John Skelton was no longer just a man who had lost his children. He was a man accused of destroying them. The stage was now set for a trial that would not just seek a conviction, but would demand the answer that had been buried in the dark, cold soil of the borderlands for an entire generation. The story of the Skelton brothers is not just a case file stored in a dusty archive. It is a living, breathing ache that resides in the heart of every person who has ever driven past that small house on State Street. As we reach the final chapter of this harrowing journey, we are forced to confront the most difficult truth of all: the weight of silence. For 15 years, the world has moved forward. Technology has transformed. Children who were the same age as Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner have grown into men, and the seasons have painted the Michigan landscape in cycles of white and green. Yet, for Tanya Zuvers and the people of Morenci, time has remained tethered to a single unanswered question: where are the boys? This silence is not accidental. It is a calculated choice made by John Skelton every single morning he wakes up in a prison cell. In the culture of true crime, we often look for the why, but in this case, the where is the only thing that offers a path to peace. To this day, despite the murder indictments and the legal declarations of death, the physical remains of the three brothers have never been recovered. They are out there somewhere, perhaps in the quiet woods of Ohio or beneath the soil of a forgotten field, waiting to be brought home. This absence of a final resting place is a secondary trauma, a lingering shadow that prevents a mother from truly being able to lay her children to rest. It is the ultimate cruelty of a man who realized that by keeping the location a secret, he could hold an entire community hostage forever. The human element of this tragedy is found in the small things. It is in the way Tanya still talks about her sons in the present tense sometimes, caught in a momentary lapse of a mother's instinct. It is in the birthday cakes that are never eaten and the school graduations that remain empty chairs in the front row. The culture of Morenci has become one of protective remembrance. They don't just remember the tragedy. They remember the boys. They remember Andrew's budding leadership, the way Alexander would tilt his head when he was thinking, and the tiny, energetic footsteps of Tanner. These children are not just names on a legal document. They are the sons of a town that refused to let them fade away. The resilience shown by Tanya is a masterclass in the power of a mother's love. She has transitioned from a victim of a horrific crime to a warrior for justice, proving that even the loudest silence can be challenged by a voice that refuses to quit. As the trial for open murder looms in the near future, the atmosphere is one of somber expectation. There is no joy in these new charges, only a grim necessity. The legal system is finally attempting to balance the scales, even if those scales are weighted with the heavy hearts of a grieving family. We must ask ourselves what justice looks like when the victims cannot be found. Is it a life sentence? Is it a confession? Or is it simply the fact that the world has finally acknowledged the truth? John Skelton may continue to hold his secret close to his chest, but he can no longer hide behind the lie of a sanctuary. The sanctuary was always a myth. The reality was a betrayal that defies human comprehension. In the end, the story of Andrew Alexander and Tanner Skelton is a reminder of the fragility of innocence and the enduring strength of the human bond. We may never know the exact details of that final Thanksgiving night, and we may never walk to a grave site to pay our respects. But the boys are not gone as long as their story is told with empathy and truth. They live on in the blue ribbons, in the justice system that finally refused to look away, and in the heart of a mother who carries them with her every single day. The silence of John Skelton is loud, but the love of a mother and the memory of a community are louder. As we close this chapter, we don't just walk away. We carry their names with us, hoping that one day the earth will finally give up its secrets and the Skelton brothers will finally be found.